Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the Province of St. Joseph. I teach at the Dominican House of Studies, and I work as an assistant director for the Thomistic Institute, and this is Pints with Aquinas. In this episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about conversion in a culture of death, specifically our own conversion and then the conversion of our contemporaries. Because I think sometimes we say to ourselves, I pertain to a culture of life. Those guys pertain to a culture of death, and we're just at loggerheads. So we're going to go back and forth until Jesus comes back, or we die, or some other foreordained end. But I think that there's more that can be done, specifically when it comes to conversion in our own lives and in the lives of our contemporaries. So here we go. All right. So it's no surprise that, as many have observed, public discourse is in a lamentable state because we've kind of given up on reasonable discourse. It's not so clear that we're actually making rational exchanges so much as we are kind of posturing in rational ways, and truth be told, just deploying like mockery, scorn, irony, victimization, protest, whatever else as the real genre of human communication. So within this setting, there might be a question posed by a thinking individual, like why even bother with arguing or advocating, or you might even say, like, why even bother with preaching or teaching? Because if the dispute is pointless, there's no sense in weighing in. But I think that what we can identify is certain parts of the current cultural crisis which are like at the root of the rotten tree and the rotten leaves and the rotten fruit, so that we can address those in our own lives and then help others address those in their lives too. So I spoke recently at the Cardinal O'Connor Conference for Life at Georgetown, which I think is the longest running undergraduate conference, or maybe the biggest undergraduate conference, pro-life conference on these particular issues. But they always hold it on the weekend during the March for Life. So it's great. It was sweet. It was a bop. But I identified three crises: the crisis of integration in ourselves and in our culture, the crisis of practicality. We don't actually care about doing anything. We're just completely content with empty rhetoric and political posturing. And then the crisis of agency, the sense that a lot of us feel like we don't matter and that we can't do anything. And I think that this has been heightened in recent years, and I think that the pandemic gave us a particularly bitter experience of these crises. But I don't think it's sufficient to say, like, okay, yeah, those guys out there, they pertain to a culture of death. I pertain to a culture of life. So it's just a matter of hunkering down, or it's a matter of, like avoiding conflicts, which will go nowhere. Because I think that it's possible to address the ways in which we ourselves suffer from these crises, namely of integration, practicality, and then agency, so that we can begin the work of conversion and then testify to how that conversion might look in the lives of others. Because often enough, if we're in an us versus them type situation, we're either being manipulated or we're falling into a trap. So if we can't acknowledge how we contribute to the problem, then we can't really envision how we can contribute to the solution. So we're all living in a culture of death. We are all at risk of being assimilated by it, and in many ways, we already have. So we have to reclaim a genuine integration, a genuine practicality, a genuine agency, so that we can contribute to a genuine culture of life, which is to say, we need to humanize the discourse, or we need to humanize our approach if we intend to humanize the culture, so that ultimately it can be divinized, which our Lord's going to do in whatsoever way he intends to do. But we ourselves can be instruments of that transformation. So we want to get back in our humanity so that we can help others get back in theirs, so that we can ultimately meet Christ in his. All right, so that's the way in which to discern the common good, encounter each other in this public space, and then build a political life together. So when I gave the talk at Georgetown, I highlighted the place of prudence. And we can note a couple of things about prudence, though you have probably heard me talk about prudence in other videos or in a book, which is called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. Sweet advertisement. But I highlighted the fact how prudence sees and prudence directs, in the sense that prudence is an intellectual virtue, so it's a virtue of the mind, and it orients us to reality in all of its dimensions. Like, that is to say, it gives us access to the world of moral truth and value. So prudence is about engaging with our experience as our experience presents itself, not just this or that aspect of our experience, but the whole of human life. And then prudence directs, which is to say it's a practical virtue, and so it appoints the various means to the attainment of our moral ends. So by virtue of the fact that we're human beings, there are various moral ends on offer. Like, we want to keep existing, and we want to procreate and educate our children, and we want to know the truth about God, and we want to live peaceably in society. But it takes moral virtues to heal those inclinations, and then prudence to appoint the means to the attainment thereof. So prudence is about right reason and things to be done. It's about practical wisdom. It's about making confident decisions. It gives us a kind of knack for our humanity. It liberates us by a kind of virtuosity so that we can conduct this search and then carry out the effectuation of our plans in accord with what we have taken in. So I was kind of arguing for an ongoing conversion in our own lives and highlighting the place of the virtue of prudence in this ongoing conversion. Specifically insofar as prudence is, integrative. I mean, it's a virtue of integration, it's a virtue of practicality, it's a virtue of agency. And I highlighted integration because it's a virtue of the mind in communion with the heart. So St. Thomas will say that the standard of virtuous action, or the truth of virtuous action, prudent action, is rectified appetite. Okay, Father Gregory, confusing, clarify what you're saying. Well, in the sense that, like, what does it mean to do the prudent thing? Well, provided that you're just, that you're courageous, that you're temperate, that your appetites are healed and grown in the way that God intends, well, you're going to have a sense for what ought to be done because you're going to be able to see it clearly and you're going to be able to pursue it well. So the standard for prudence is sound desire. So sound desire looks to prudence to appoint the means to the attainment of its ends, but basically, like, prudence is pulling us together as human beings, so we're no longer, headed in that direction or that direction and that direction, but that we're actually pursuing an integral human good in a way that's orderly, in a way that's hierarchical, in a way that reflects our genuine dignity. So we'll call prudence the charioteer of the virtues, insofar as it, directs all of our appetites towards the human end, and then it kind of regulates amongst them so that they're in close communication and that they don't interfere with each other. Okay, so that's to say that it's a virtue of integration. It's also a virtue of practicality. Prudence heals us from this fear that real life is elsewhere, because effectively what prudence does is that it does the best with what it has in the time afforded, right? Because we can't have speculative certainty about the various activities in our lives. We can only have practical certainty about them or moral certainty about them. Like, there's just so much contingency, there's so much matter that weighs into our moral decision making that we're always going to have to be doing, the best that we can with what we have and the time afforded. And so prudence is this great virtue which takes universal principles and then it applies them to particular situations so that we can, do well, so that we can live in accord with our human call and with our human excellence. So prudence isn't scandalized by, it might be better if, or it might be perfect if. Prudence is looking to do something good. It might be looking to do something best, but often enough we just don't have enough information or we don't have enough experience in order to perform the type of action which would accurately be described as best. We're trying to make our way, and prudence helps us to do that by giving us a kind of confidence that, here we are in the material world doing contingent things for practical purposes. So then the last would be that prudence is a virtue for agency, that it helps us to be real protagonists in the moral life. So we'll talk about the fact that, like, when you reason in the practical order, the judgment that you make is just the action, right? It eventuates in action. So it's not like you're supposed to make a judgment and the fruit of that judgment is, I might prayerfully consider as an option for my future that I ought to, ... No, like, you actually act in determining what to do, you do. And it's this type of thing which can affect a genuine transformation of the culture, right? So prudence, it's not like art, which we might describe as skill or technique or craftsmanship, a virtue which Aristotle and St. Thomas describe, which is about making. Okay, so like in the fine arts, for instance, the standard of excellence is the canvas, or the painting or the statue or whatever it is, the building constructed. So if it's good, right, you make your judgment on the basis of that. If it's bad, you make your judgment on the basis of that. You don't think too terribly much in terms of the artist's intention, because whether he was pious and devout in performing the action or whether he was impious and blasphemous, it doesn't matter too much provided the thing itself is beautiful, okay? That can weigh in a secondary sense. But with prudence, right, we're not here to optimize or maximize. We're not here just to produce results. We're not here just to govern outcomes. We're here to be transformed as moral agents, right? So we're looking for the type of thing which is genuinely good, which reflects, again, our human dignity and helps us attain to our human ends. So I was just thinking, too, in terms of like the Dobbs decision. Why do we celebrate the Dobbs decision? It's not because it's necessarily going to reduce the number of abortions. It actually looks like since the first time, I mean, I suppose this is the first time in like over 30 years, but since like 2020, abortions are on the rise. Now, are we going to be able to determine whether Dobbs is in any way responsible for that? Doesn't seem like it. I mean, obviously 2020 is before the Dobbs decision. But like, will Dobbs be a success provided that it reduces the number of abortions? Maybe to a certain extent, but I think that Dobbs will have been a success if it helps us as agents to take more seriously this work of transformation of our lives and then of the lives of our contemporaries by testifying to the gift of life and by working sedulously for its protection. Right? It's about the transformation of the agent. It's about the transformation of the culture. It's not just about producing results or outcomes. Okay, so. With this in mind, okay, the idea here is that we're all in a culture of death. We're being assimilated to it. We're not just like, I'm part of a culture of life and I have nothing to do with the culture of death. No, it needs to be actively resisted by the cultivation of virtue so that we can build up a genuine culture. And so just thinking about these crises of, on the one hand, integration, on the other hand, practicality, if you have three hands, on the third hand, of agency. What are the types of things that we can do in the pro-life movement so as to accomplish this type of transformation? And I highlighted a couple of things. The first was to empower women and to valorize motherhood. And then the second was to testify to God's providence. So what do I mean by that? I mean, obviously, those are just two things. They're just the two things that I chose. There are several other things that can be done, and people ask great questions at the conference to help reflect upon that. But we're thinking about practicing prudence so as to elicit prudence, so as to transform the culture, that is to say, build up a culture of life. When it comes to empowering women and valorizing motherhood, I think a lot of women feel acutely like this idea, my life is at odds ends, all right? There's nothing I can do. I myself have been deprived of my agency, etc. But by empowering women and valorizing motherhood, we can work against that, right? So you're familiar with the burden argument, that women bear a disproportionate burden in carrying a child to term because the child gestates in her womb rather than in the womb of the father. So that's true. The difficulty is disproportionate. I know of no men who suffer from morning sickness. But here's the thing. Life deals disproportionate difficulties at every turn, and typically you don't respond by insisting on reproductive rights. The ordinary means is to express our esteem, our appreciation, our love, and genuine solidarity to help these people to carry their burdens so that those who profit thereby might all take part in whatever it is that's at hand. And so I think, for instance, there are certain people who defend the Republic from attackers, from enemies, like servicemen and women. What do we typically do to express our solidarity with them? Well, often enough, you'll thank them. Like you see a serviceman in the airport and you still thank you for your service. I was recently at an airport terminal and somebody had been, 20 years in the armed services and we all recognized him and it was really cool. It was like a simple act of solidarity. Or, the government or the local community finds ways of supporting that person's education, supporting that person's family, etc. You can think here, too, of ways that type of logic might be extended to women and mothers in a peculiar way. One culture that sought to do this was Sparta. Now, mind you, I'm not holding Sparta up as to be emulated because they practiced widespread abortion. So I'm just highlighting one particular aspect. But funereal rights were extended to men who died in battle of a very dignified or esteemed sort. But similar funereal rights were extended to women who died in childbirth, because they furnished the polis with its fighting force. So there was a real clear connection between the women who bore the children who grew to the men who fought the battles. And I think that we can do a similar work, of translation in our own mind, rather than constantly tapping our toes when we're behind a mother with her two children in the line at the supermarket, right? We can express our esteem, we can express our appreciation, we express our love. Doesn't mean that you say thank you for your service, because that's probably creepy. But you can do things, find ways to do things to express your solidarity. I've seen this with my sisters. One has 5 kids, the other has 4 kids. And just the local community is super awesome when it comes to helping them in really beautiful ways. Because there's a sense to all those who pitch in that it matters and that it's good and that it's beautiful. And I think so we can direct, our contemporaries' attention to things like that, and we can direct their attention to the example of holy mothers in the tradition, like St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, or like St. Gianna Beretta Molla, or like Blessed Jane of Azza, who is the mother of St. Dominic. She had 3 sons. They all became priests. I imagine that for her, that was a difficulty. She might have been proud of her sons, of her priests, but I imagine that it was tough to not have any grandkids. And when she had St. Dominic in her womb, she had an image that she bore a dog with a torch in its mouth who was destined to run around the world and set it ablaze. And when we think of fire, we think of the evangelical fire, which, we associate with the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, right? Which fire, it refines, it purifies, but it also burns. And so she probably saw in that vision a kind of prophecy of the way in which she would be enlivened or enkindled by the proclamation of the gospel brought by her sons, but also burned by it. And she chose that, right? She chose that courageously. She chose that nobly, which I think is something to celebrate, something to preach about, something to testify to. There's this cool pro-life ministry a number of years back called the Caring Foundation, and they had a keen insight. They said, it's not so much that these women don't know that they bear a child in their womb, that is, women in crisis pregnancy centers. They know that often enough. And it's not that they don't know that they're killing their child when they choose to have an abortion. Many of them know that too. But for them, it's choice more of who dies. It's either the baby dies, or my kind of self-understanding as a potentially good mother dies. Because, if, let's say I give this child up for adoption, I'm not a good mother. I've abandoned the child. I've just left the child exposed to whatever fate awaits it in another family, in another home. Or my future dies, right? As somebody who's well-educated, as somebody who's well-placed in the job market, as somebody who has a future which is of her determining, right? So it's just a matter of who dies, and it's a matter of whether the baby dies or whether the mother dies. And so the Caring Foundation ran these ads which helped kind of address that fear. You'd have these women who would be in, high-powered jobs, or cool jobs, like getting off the back of a fire truck saying, I thought this baby was going to kill me, and it didn't. Just simple stuff like that. So rather than saying, we love babies, we love, blah, blah, blah. We love babies. Yes, we do. We love babies. How about you? Which I don't actually think corresponds to anyone's felt need. You can address women in their felt need by empowering them and then valorizing their motherhood, potential or actual. So then the second thing I was going to highlight is this idea of testifying to God's providence. God, we say, permits evil to befall only that he might bring about from it or bring out of it some good. St. Augustine repeats this often enough. And I think that the fear with unplanned pregnancies is that no good could come of it. I think often of Matthew 13, where Christ tells 7 parables, one of which is the wheat and the weeds. In that parable, the master, he has his servants sow wheat in the field, and then an enemy comes and he sows weeds, and then the two pop up together, and the servants of the master say, hey, I thought you sowed good seed. And he says, yeah, well, an enemy has done this. And then they're like, do you want us to weed them out? And he says, no, let them grow up together, and then at the end, gather the weeds together, burn them with fire, and then pull the wheat into the barn, get the grain. So there's this sense that, all right, all of this takes place within the field. All of it happens within the bounds of God's providence. So even if something seems to depart from God's providence, God makes it to return to him. If it seems to depart by transgression, God makes it return to him by punishment or by mercy or by whatever else. And then it says, when men sleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat. It doesn't say that the master sleeps, because the master doesn't sleep. He who watches over Israel slumbers not nor sleeps. He sees, right? And he permits. Why? That he might bring about from it some good, some kind of weird textured good. And then he permits them to grow up together. Why? Because he despairs of them and this is all fatalistic? No, because, says St. Augustine, such is the mercy of God that he can make weeds into wheat. He can transform them. So God does not despair of any life, in the sense that God desires that all be saved and come to knowledge of the truth. So I think that the women who experience an unplanned pregnancy, they feel this kind of sense of the improvident God acutely, and there's been a seed sown in them which they do not welcome. But you can testify to the fact that God, granting that this child is a weed, which it's not, right? But he can make weeds wheat. He can make the weed of the present situation become the wheat of salvation. There's a pregnancy center in Louisville, Kentucky. There is still a pregnancy center in Louisville, Kentucky, where I was assigned for a year, who I thought did this really well. And they had these billboards, which just, they crushed it. They were so cool because they were so charming and like whimsical. And I think they captured this aspect of Providence, and they did it really well. So they had a beautiful billboard that just said, surprises can be a good thing, which I love. And they had another billboard that just said, you've got it in you. Like, think about that. It's not a judgment, right? It's not a castigation. It's an invitation to see the world through redeemed eyes. And I think that we can help people to see the world through redeemed eyes by testifying to God's providence, by telling our stories of the ways in which we, though sad, anxious, and lonely, have been blessed by God in the midst of our difficulties, even if it's not as, acute as the difficulty of an unplanned pregnancy, even if our lives may not compare in all of their various details. So those are the things that I wanted to communicate. Those are the things I wanted to highlight. And I hope that they are of some service to you. So yes, public discourse is in a lamentable state. Sure, there is little in the way of substantive exchange, but we should bother with arguing and advocating. We should bother with preaching and teaching. Because we're not here simply for producing results. We're here for transforming hearts, not simply for outcomes, but for persons and culture. Ultimately, it's a matter of who we are and what we are meant to become, and that, I think, gets closer to the heart of what it means to pertain to a culture of life. So by a growth in prudence, we endeavor to heal and grow from beyond this culture of death as we welcome our contemporaries back into their humanity so that they can meet Christ in his humanity. So by empowering women and valorizing motherhood, by testifying to God's providence, we can welcome others into life and perhaps even take small strides in building up what could genuinely be called a culture of life. So that is what I hope to share. Sorry, a bit long this time. My apologies. But this is Pints of the Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe on YouTube. Push the little bell there and get sweet email updates when other things come out. If you haven't yet, check out Godsplaining. We've got a couple of episodes recently on the pro-life movement. You might profit from those if you just search Godsplaining Pro-Life. And then apropos of prudence, like I said, I wrote a book. It's called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. If you haven't yet read it, maybe you could. Maybe you'd profit from it. I tend to think you will, but I try not to recommend things too heartily because sometimes it produces the opposite response. Life is crazy. All right. Know of my prayers for you. Please pray for me, and I'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.